hi to everyone. Welcome to the fifth seminar in the Women in Public Policy Program seminar series of the fall semester. The Women in Public Policy Program equips leaders and changemakers with rigorous evidence-based strategies to advance women and gender equity. My name is Dara Cohen, and I am a Ford Foundation Associate Professor of Public Policy here at the Harvard Kennedy School, and I have the pleasure of leading the seminar series this fall semester. The series this fall is entirely devoted to issues of gender, sex, and war, and we have an amazing slate of 12 speakers in the series who are joining us virtually from around the world. We also want to acknowledge our appreciation of the generous support provided by Carol Hamilton, who is a Women's Leadership Board member, in making today's programming possible. The Carol Hamilton Gender and Conflict Fund supports a new community here at the Harvard Kennedy School among scholars of gender, conflict, and sexual violence. Today, we are joined by Professor Richard Eichenberg, who is going to be presenting his research, Gender, War, and World Order: What Explains Gender Differences on Issues of War and Peace. Professor Eichenberg is an associate professor at Tufts University. His research focuses on public opinion, foreign policy, European integration, and gender politics. Professor Eichenberg has held grants and fellowships from the Mellon Foundation, the Ford Foundation, the Center for International Affairs at Harvard University, and the Social Science Research Council. Professor Eichenberg is a non-resident senior fellow on public opinion and foreign policy at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs. And from 2004 to 2014, he served as an academic advisor for Transatlantic Trends, which is the German Marshall Fund's annual survey of American and European public opinion on security issues. We welcome WAP's podcast community today, which has downloaded our seminars over 54,000 times, and we're very pleased to have a lasting and broad-reaching impact beyond those who are able to join us today. So the plan for today is our speaker will talk for about 30 minutes, and then we will have 10 minutes for Q&A from the virtual audience. We do request that audience members hold your questions until the end of the talk, and then for those who have a question, you will have the opportunity to be unmuted and ask your question out loud. We do ask that all audience questions are very brief, are on topic, and are posed in the form of a question, and of course are related to our speaker's presentation today. My colleague, Laura, will be managing the Q&A portion of the seminar today. And with that, I will turn the floor over to Professor Eichenberg. Thank you again for joining us today.
Thank you very much. Thanks everybody for coming to this virtual seminar. And thank you, Dara, for that very kind introduction. I think it's probably been 2 or 3 years since you and I had lunch in Davis Square. And when the world returns to normal, maybe we'll do that again. The talk I'm going to give today is based on my book published just last year. As Dara said, it's called Gender, War, and World Order. If you're a member of the Harvard community, you can get the print version or the ebook version via Hollis. It's also available as an ebook if you're listening to the podcast in many university libraries around the world, or of course you can request that your librarian acquire it. If you want a copy for yourself, you can get it from Amazon or Cornell University Press, and the ebook version is about half price. Enough of the commercials. Let me proceed with my talk. Here's an overview of what I'd like to talk about today. In a minute, I'll talk about my methodological approach to answering the question that Professor Cohen has put to me: what explains the gender gap in war? Then I'll provide a brief overview of the data, that is to say the magnitude and variation of gender difference across countries and across time. But before I do that, I want to talk about 2 bodies of thought that purport to explain gender difference on war. One, I think, does not, or 2 bodies of thought I think do not explain those gender differences very well, and 2 bodies of thought I think there is substantial evidence to support them. Let me take each in turn. The 2 bodies of thought that do not explain gender difference. The first is essentialist biological hypotheses. These are largely based on the biological fact that women give birth and nurture life soon after birth. That gives rise to a division of labor in which men are the providers and the protectors, and women are the caretakers of their children and indeed the broader community. One version of this hypothesis, or this stream of hypotheses, is that gender difference arises also from differences in the average size and strength of our bodies. That is to say, on average, men are indeed larger and have stronger upper body strength. These presumed biological facts might help explain why men and women take different views on matters of war and peace. Now, we have to be cautious about this, of course, because body size and strength are presumably related to the fact that men have preferential access to nutrition, or traditionally have, and are encouraged to engage in strenuous exercise and other forms of activity, whereas women, until quite recently, were discouraged from precisely that sort of activity, or risk being labeled a tomboy, of course. Now, the upshot of this essentialist biological view for our topic today is that gender differences on war and peace should be largely constant across issues, times, and cultures, because there's little evidence that there's much biological or indeed evolutionary difference across time, cultures, and, let us say, a level of economic development. A second body of thought, which I think is little supported by the evidence, is that gender difference actually arises from socialization to broader worldviews that certainly include war, but also lots of other issues in international relations. These bodies of thought resemble the realist and liberal outlooks on international relations that we study in our classrooms all the time. For those who study gender politics, the most visible scholars are Josh Goldstein, whom I believe students in Professor Cohen's class may be reading this semester, but also Ann Tickner, who's been a pioneer in the study of gender and politics and international relations. Briefly summarized, Goldstein in particular argues that the realist school of thought is actually a highly masculinized version of international relations. It's atomistic and individualistic, in which individual states compete for power and influence. The world is one of latent insecurities, and therefore one has to rely on strength, power, and balance of power in order to provide security, and then ultimately, of course, on the possibility of engaging in conflict to defend your interests. Women, in Goldstein's view, are socialized to represent the feminist others. That is the opposite of the strength and emotional stoicism that men are socialized to adopt. Women are community-oriented rather than individualist-oriented. They seek connection rather than separation. And of course, they seek cooperation, often in an institutional setting, such as the United Nations. Okay. Now, in a bit, I'll talk about why I don't think there's much evidence for these two first bodies of thought, but I wanted to lay them out for you. Now, there are two bodies of thought, I think, for which there is substantial evidence that helps explain gender difference on war. One I call threat, risk, anxiety, and violence. This is largely based on the research of Professor Leonie Huddy at Stony Brook University in New York, but it's also broadly represented in the literatures of sociology, social psychology, and political science on fear of crime and other sources of threat and anxiety. According to Professor Huddy, women indeed experience higher feelings of threat from their environment, danger, if you will, fear, if you will, and they experience higher levels of anxiety about those dangers and threats. However, they do not endorse militant or forceful reactions to those threats. So, for example, at the level of fear of crime, women do indeed fear crime more than men, but they're less likely to support the death penalty, for example. And in Professor Huddy's research, women did indeed experience higher levels of threat after the terrorist attacks of 2001, but they were less likely to support forceful responses to that threat, in particular the war in Afghanistan. Professor Huddy explains this by arguing that the anxiety that results from fear and threat actually leads to risk averse behavior. It leads to caution and to taking steps to avoid the costs that would be associated with those dangers. And that includes the costs and risks of violence. If this is true, of course, we would expect gender differences to be above all high on issues of war and violence, and perhaps less evident on other international issues. Finally, there is a body of thought which argues that attitudes on many social issues, including attitudes towards the military and war and peace, is related to the process of economic development and ultimately the emergence of gender equality. A lot of this work is associated with Professor Pippa Norris, who is your colleague, of course, in the Kennedy School, together with her research with Ronald Engelhardt from the University of Michigan. Since you see my Michigan baseball cap on the wall behind me, you won't be surprised to learn that I studied with Professor Engelhardt some years ago. Briefly put, this argument is that economic development is associated with two social changes that contribute to the emergence of more gender equal attitudes. One of them is access to the labor force for women, and the second is access to higher levels of education, which empirically have indeed been the case as processes of economic development unfold. This, of course, contributes to the material independence of women, and also, in Pippa's words, to the psychological autonomy of women as their views are differentiated from the patriarchal views that previously held sway. Or to put it in the words of two political scientists at Yale, Rosenbluth and Everson, it used to be the case, indeed, even in the social sciences, especially economics, that household preferences were assumed to be unitary, and they were assumed to follow the preferences of the head of household, usually a male. As women enter the labor market, become materially independent, and gain access to higher education, their views are differentiated, and one has to take account of the fact that they are probably different from the patriarch, so to speak. All of these things contribute to more gender equal attitudes in the arguments of Pippa Norris and Ron Engelhardt. As I said, I think there's some evidence for these two latter schools of thought. So let me proceed to show you some of the evidence I presented in the book. First, let me explain the methodology. The fact of the matter is, and this is a great source of frustration to me, is that there's no single opinion survey that would allow us to evaluate these competing ideas in any thorough, comprehensive way. Most existing surveys deal with a single conflict, let's say the war over Kosovo or the conflict in Rwanda, or particular issues, defense spending, alliances, or indeed war and peace. By definition, surveys take place at single points in time unless you have sufficient funding to do them repeatedly. So it's very difficult to gain any historical perspective, any process-oriented perspective. And again, for reasons of cost, they're usually carried out in a single country or a small sample of countries. It is, of course, conceivable to define a comprehensive survey such as the one I'm describing, but it would probably be prohibitively expensive. Therefore, I took a different approach, very much keeping in my tradition of my training at the University of Michigan, which is heavily empirical and data-oriented, which was to try and gather up every survey item I could find since about 1980 for a variety of conflicts: Kosovo, Rwanda, Somalia, Bosnia, the Iraq War, and so on and so forth, for as many countries as possible, and for as many different security issues as possible, so I could study whether the attitudes towards war and peace were replicated on other security issues short of war. So for example, in my chapter on the United States, I analyzed 965 survey items since 1980. And in the two chapters on global public opinion, I analyzed a collection that I did of over 1,000 individual survey items. And I'll be showing you those in a bit. So the standard of evidence I take in the book is not from a single survey, but rather from the weight of the evidence across all of these issues, conflicts, countries, and periods of time. If the weight of the evidence across all of these issues or all of these considerations point in the direction of one explanation, I try to draw that conclusion. If they don't support a particular conclusion, I try to point that out. Excuse me, before I get into the data, I'm going to take a water break. Let me apologize in advance if the fonts on these slides are are too small. I assume that you can stick your face in the screen and see them. I won't do that because you wouldn't enjoy it very much. But I have to admit my eyesight isn't what it once was. Let me start here with a summary of my global public opinion collection. This table shows gender difference over a period of 25 years for a maximum of 51 countries. In the lower right-hand corner, you'll see, as I said on the prior slide, that there are 1,094 individual survey items that I collected. And I show here the level of support of men and women to these military actions. Notice that I kept very close track, detailed track of the type of military action that is being considered or in fact underway, beginning here at the top of the table with air and missile strikes, the presence of troops in an ongoing conflict, war, and so on and so forth. The average difference across all of these issues is 8 percentage points. And on the assumption that most of them come from surveys that have subsamples of about 500 women and about 500 men, it means that the gender difference on average is highly significant. But an additional point that's quite relevant is that there's a great variety of gender difference, or there's variation in gender difference depending upon how the question is phrased. If you ask the question in a rather general way, here I'm showing a question that often asked if you would approve or disapprove of a military action against fill in the blank, Iraq, Serbia, whatever it happens to be. And the gender difference is only 6 points on that rather vague formulation. But if you mention specific actions like missile strikes, presence of troops, and the like, the gender difference increases. But the important point here, which I'll come back to and which you can imagine affects my conclusions, is that these are not constant and categorical. They vary a great deal. And women are skeptical of using military force, but on some issues, they're hardly pacifist. So the categorical explanations, including the biological one, is thrown into some doubt. I'm going to continue now with a lot of data. And this one, I hope you will help me out with in the question and answer period. There's something about drones. Gender difference in attitudes towards US drone strikes, which have been surveyed by the German Marshall Fund and the Pew Global Attitudes Project, are truly large. I know the font is small here, but the percentage of women who support drone strikes in the Czech Republic is 30 percentage points less than men. That is the single largest gender difference I think I've seen on any question, anytime, any place. Although I have to admit, the gender difference on the vote share of Biden and Trump at the moment is coming close. You'll notice here there's a group of countries where up to well over 20% of women are less supportive of drone strikes, thus the negative numbers. And I would say certainly more than half the countries on this chart show a statistically significant difference. Now, it's an interesting question why drone strikes in particular evoke this large gender difference, but I'm probably running out of time, so I'm going to leave to the Q&A for you to answer the question for me. Let me just continue. Here's a basic question that's going to play an important role in later portions of my talk. It's a gender difference on a fundamental attitude towards war. This happens to be a reading from June-October 2013, for which I have a lot of countries. But the question, in fact, is very, very old. It was originated by a social psychologist at the University of Chicago in the 1930s. His name was L.L. Thurstone, and he was a pioneer in the development of attitude scales. One of the scales he was trying to develop in the 1930s, as the shadow of war started to spread across Europe, was a pacifism scale. And one of the items on that pacifism scale included the question, do you agree or disagree that war is sometimes necessary to achieve justice? Now, we can debate the utility of this question, but what he was trying to get at are people's ambivalent feelings about war. It's largely an unpleasant thing, but maybe it's necessary sometimes. It turns out that this question, as I will point out later, is strongly correlated with a wide range of national security issues. What I simply wanted to show in this graph is that answers to that question are highly gendered. Once again, we see differences of up to 20 percentage points, with women showing less support for the proposition. In a variety of countries, Belgium, it's -23, and in Mexico, it's -19. In Argentina, it's -16. So it's pretty convincing evidence that across cultures, across levels of economic development, across political systems, women's skepticism of war is dramatically large. However, the same goes for some of the earlier slides. There is also substantial variation. It's not a constant in every country. So let me go back to those bodies of thought that don't explain gender difference, and I've sort of let the cat out of the bag already. As I argued earlier, if there were an essentialist categorical biological difference between the biological sexes on issues of war and peace, we would expect to see fairly large, constant gender variation. But what we're seeing is a great deal of variation. And I'll just leave it at that. Now, on the question of socialization to a broader worldviews, a more masculine realist perspective versus a more liberal feminist perspective, with the exception of one example, I'm going to leave that to the reading, your reading of the book. I have to leave you with some homework. But I will summarize by saying that there's little evidence of gender difference in attitudes towards institutions like the United Nations, like on alliances, surprisingly enough, like the NATO alliance, or on issues of power and balance of power. Now, there is one exception, and that's the United States, which I'd like to show you now. Here's a very nice question. It's nice because it's clean, crisp, and easy to interpret. The percent who agree with the statement that the best way to ensure peace is through military strength. Certainly people of my generation have heard this statement from politicians many, many times. Notice in the answers to the question that few in Western or Eastern Europe tend to agree with this statement. And even among those few who do agree, the gender differences are relatively small. More people in Turkey support the proposition, but again, there are small gender differences. It's only in the United States that there is a significant gender difference. 55% of men agree with the statement, 44% of women agree with the statement. So this is one of those mythical cases where if only men could vote, 55% would vote for military strength, but if only women could vote, only 44% would vote for that proposition. I should add that on other issues that I characterized on the prior slide, for example, favorability towards the role of the United Nations, the United States is unique in the sense that there is a gender cleavage on that issue. There's also a very, very strong partisan cleavage on that issue. But in most countries of the world, and it's been studied, and it's in my book, in 40 or 50 countries, the two genders agree largely on attitudes towards the UN, and they're usually pretty favorable. The United States is polarized, and gender and partisanship are two characteristics of that polarization. Of course, this points us to another body of thought, which is that the individual characteristics of some countries may very well condition gender difference, and that is certainly true in this particular case. The United States is a global superpower. It's intervened militarily many times, and on many occasions has had difficulty securing the endorsement of the United Nations, which has further polarized politics within the United States on national security issues. Now, there are two bodies of thought for which there's substantial evidence, most of which I very sneakily have already presented to you. We've seen evidence that when we ask questions or we examine questions about war, lesser military actions, more violent forms of military actions, as opposed to vague references to quote unquote military actions in general, we find very high gender differences. I show in the book that this is true of other types of violence. For example, torture. American attitudes towards torture are highly polarized by gender, extremely so. and interestingly, also within political parties. That is to say, Republicans on average are more supportive of torture, but within the Republican Party, women are much less supportive than their male counterparts. Now, on this issue of war and violence being the primary issue, we have to remember that it's important in a double sense because it has an indirect effect on other attitudes. And let me tell you what I mean by that. If you analyze a survey on support for defense spending, for example, you'll find that gender itself is not a terribly significant correlate of support for defense spending. The strongest correlates are partisanship and and some measure of basic attitude towards war or acceptance of or toleration of war. This is true, for example, in research by Hurwitz and Peffley, Larry Bartels, and others, including myself. But the fact of the matter is those basic attitudes towards war, as we have just seen, are themselves highly gendered. So that indirectly through that question, other national security issues or the politics of national security issues are implicated, if you will, in the domestic political environment, so to speak. Now, on the issue of violence and why this is the issue, which may seem like a pretty obvious question, I'll return with some thoughts in just a moment when I talk about additional research. Before I do that, though, I wanted to show you that there is some evidence for the gender equality hypothesis. Laura, do I have more than 5 minutes?
Hi, Richard. Yes, you have 5 minutes.
Great. This chart shows on the horizontal axis an index of the political empowerment of women, which I took from the Davos Economic Forum Gender Gap Report, which is a great document, by the way. And on the vertical axis, I show the magnitude of the gender difference on the acceptance of war question that I talked about earlier. As you can see, there is a positive relationship. It is a statistically significant one across societies. That is to say, the higher level of political empowerment of women, which is basically based on office holding in the executive and legislative branches, the higher the gender difference within societies. Now, it's also true that other factors affect this relationship. India has fairly high political representation of women, but relatively low gender difference on the war question. And there are some others that go in the opposite direction. Now, I think the story that this is telling, if I may take just a little bit of license with causality here, is that there may be a basic predisposition in which women in particular are skeptical of violence, and that this difference, this gender difference, is magnified and amplified as they're empowered by the economic and political changes that come with the society's transition to higher or to gender equality attitudes that are higher as they develop. But I'll leave any more discussion of that to the question period. This last point is important, so I want to take whatever time Laura will give me for it. Why is it that violence is the issue? It's not the United Nations, it's not biology, it's only secondarily economic development, as I just articulated. Why might that be the case? Now, it's true that there's a lot of scholarship on this, and I assign it in my class. But the fact of the matter is, this is an issue on which I have learned more from my students than I have from the scholarship. Because when I posed this question in my gender politics class, which I think I mentioned is 90% female, and over 15 years, I've had 20 to 25 students. So I basically have had a focus group of over 300 very bright young people. They look at me like I'm clueless. And they say, because we experience it every day. I remember a time in the class when a subsequent graduate of the Kennedy School, I might proudly say, brought to class an article she found that was authored by a woman at the Harvard Divinity School. And it frustrates me that I cannot find that article again. So if you know it, please let me know. The title of that article was "Women Know Violence." And she articulated the view in that article, and the student explained it to her classmates that in their daily lives, in their comings and goings, women worry about violence all the time. They have to worry about their personal security and safety. And then we went around the class, and every single one of those young women in the classroom articulated this point of view from a very personal perspective. One of them resented the fact that despite the fact that she didn't want to have to do it, it probably was a good idea to have somebody walk her to the door if they were coming home late at night. Another expressed frustration that her training for the Boston Marathon was always interrupted by harassment and catcalling on the jogging trails, and so on and so forth. So my point is, not only did they all point to the same thing, they pointed to it with an intensity that suggests that it's a salient part of their daily lives. And of course, the contrast with the relatively few men in the class was very striking. They pointed out that they go through the day without worrying about these things at all. Now, this may be a stretch from my students in my classroom to scholarly studies of international relations, but the fact of the matter is, it seems to me that women who think about violence, who live under what I call the shadow of violence every day, are much more likely to react cautiously to the prospect of violent conflict, including international war, especially as we have discovered from the scholarship, especially over the last 20 years, that women and girls are often substantial or even primary victims of that conflict. And the scholarship of your own Professor Cohn is a perfect example of that. I'm going to finish by showing you some questions that I'm pursuing along these lines in my existing research. I'm going to put it very simply because you can look at it later, but the second and third items in the chart are questions which ask, respectively, if respondents worry about becoming a victim of gun violence. That's the second one. The third one is whether they worry about being a victim of a terrorist attack. The light blue bars are women. As you can see, they're much more likely to worry about those two forms of violence by the order of about 11 to 17%. The highest difference, however, is the first one in this chart. This is a question that I really like. It comes from a social psychologist named Schwartz, and thus it's part of a battery called the Schwartz Personal Value Battery. And it asks people about certain characteristics of individual, and it asks them if that's a person that they resemble. So for example, the question would say, there's a person who highly values safety and security. That person avoids danger. And they have to respond by saying, yeah, that's very much like me, or that's not like me. As you can see, I call this safe and secure. And as you can see, there's a very large gender difference, which confirms everything that my students were telling me in the classroom. 60% of women respond that they're the type of person who values safety and security and that they take steps to avoid danger. Okay? Only 39% of men respond that they do the same. This kind of confirms my belief that, or it tantalizes my curiosity about whether this valuing of safety and security, which I think is a product of the experience women have in their daily lives, translates into support for or against certain type of military actions. I suspect they do. I conducted this survey, so I have the data, but I have not yet done the analysis to find out. So if in about 2 years you have room for a speaker in the seminar, ask me back and I'll tell you what the answer to that question is. And with that, I will thank you for listening.